Colleagues, I'm a Métis Ukrainian who grew up and lives on the beautiful Treaty 6 territory. I want to thank my colleague, Senator Anderson, for her thoughtful land acknowledgement. I, too, am grateful to work on Algonquin territory. Over a decade ago, I was the executive producer of a video that investigated Cree concepts of law. We had presented protocol to two very learned Cree elders to provide teachings and to help us understand the philosophy that guided Cree doctrine. During that circle, the elders also spoke at length about colonization and how it affected them, their families, and their nation. They spoke about racist laws that removed children from the embrace of their families, only to return as young adults with serious mental health issues like addictions, or maybe never to return at all. They spoke of devastating economic policies that hamstrung their nations and committed their people to poverty. These stories were very difficult to listen to, and I and my whole research and production team were becoming very emotional. The elders could see it because it was written all over our body language, and at one point, one of the elders put his hand up and told us we needed to stop. And I'll paraphrase his teaching. He said that there's no place in healing for blame, shame, and guilt. He said that if we were going to solve the issues that we are facing today, we can't be constantly looking back and blaming each other for what happened. He said that we needed to work together to build a sacred relationship, a wahotowin, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and nations. And to do that, we needed to understand our shared history. Without understanding how the past influences the present, we cannot possibly create a better future. Notice that he didn't mention anger. I've heard many elders say that anger is a gift from the Creator. Properly directed, anger is the emotion that gets us up out of our chairs and motivates us to make change. But after decades of healing through ceremony, this elder had come to understand that it's only through kindness, respect, and humility that we can heal and reconcile our collective relationship. Blame, shame, and guilt does nothing but derails the process. This teaching has stayed with me, and it guides my work. For over a decade, I've delivered training that unpacks colonial law, the effect it's had on First Nations and Métis people, families, and communities, and offers a framework for healing, reconciliation, and resilience building. This is not cultural awareness training. This is the facilitation of a personal unpacking of colonial bias and an examination of our collective relationship. And to be clear, healing is necessary for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. The deep misunderstandings and racist stereotypes about First Peoples of Turtle Island have deprived not only Indigenous people of their humanity, but also deprived non-Indigenous people across this country to profoundly beautiful teachings and culture. It has deprived generations of Canadians of a sacred relationship that would transform our country. While I've enjoyed providing this training for community-based service providers and agencies, my focus has always been to train leaders within institutions, judges, Crown prosecutors, executive directors, and ADMs, to facilitate a critical dialogue that promotes the unpacking of colonial bias and assumptions that almost invisibly guide policy and decision-making. Because we live in a country where I can't find one example of a mayor, a cabinet minister, or a premier being violently arrested and detained for an expired license plate registration. I looked. Truthfully, elected officials are given honorifics, whether we deserve them or not, and are generally treated with respect or even deference by the police. It's systemic racism that creates a reality where police feel justified in using extreme violence while interacting with a democratically elected chief of a First Nation for the same non-criminal infraction a few months ago. The fact that people in leadership positions in law enforcement cannot define systemic racism is a glaring symptom of the problem. The truth is that police relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people are complex and colonial. They require unpacking and renewal. Most importantly, we need independent, accessible, transparent, and timely review of incidents of police violence, and at the very least, meaningful consequences for dehumanizing and brutal behavior. The killing of 8 Indigenous people by police since April must be transparently investigated. We live in a country where police officers have, after receiving my training, in close quarters revealed that when called to a child welfare matter, if the name sounds white, the conversation between the officers is about how do we help this family. But if the name sounds Indigenous, the discussion immediately turns to where will we place the children. Clearly, they think that this is a foregone conclusion because their experience tells them that apprehension is typical for Indigenous families. The colonial bias in that assumption allows them to be complacent, to never question why. The truth is, most frontline workers are still not trained in evidence-based, historic trauma-informed service delivery. They receive no information on colonization and how it affects Indigenous people today. And I know that because I've been involved in that training. Systemic racism is deadly because it creates apathy, indifference, and hopelessness in service delivery. It does not compel our institutions to learn, adapt, and innovate. We live in a country where children are not consistently nor meaningfully taught the Indigenous perspectives of the many treaties of this country, peace and friendship treaties, treaties 1 through 11 that are at the foundation of our Confederation, as well as modern treaties. Generations of Canadians have no idea that these contracts between sovereign nations set out Canada's obligations to First Nations in exchange for sharing the land and its resources. And as a result, most Canadians do not understand that Canada has not met the fiduciary obligations and responsibilities outlined in treaties. Systemic racism creates this vacuum of knowledge, a space where misunderstandings, stereotypes, and myths about Indigenous people are more freely accepted and exchanged in our society than the truth. Like the saying goes, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets a chance to get its pants on. And at the very least, our school systems, kindergarten through post-secondary, must teach the truth. At the very least. But you know, when I think about those elders' teachings, I realize that if I want to be part of the reconciliation movement, I cannot create blame, shame, or guilt when speaking with individuals about institutional or personal racism. It doesn't help, and it actually has the opposite effect. Rather than changing anyone's mind, it causes people to double down and to defend their position viciously. When one group shouts Black Lives Matter or Indigenous Lives Matter, the other group shouts All Lives Matter. When Indigenous and Black people tell us they feel they're not valued in our society, we need to listen. It's only with kindness, respect, and humility that we can understand each other's perspectives and reconcile our differences, that we can imagine and create relationships and institutions that are more human and humane. Colleagues, the unpacking and dismantling of colonial bias in institutions of our country is long overdue. I'm tired of organizations and departments that position themselves as leaders in reconciliation but are not interested in dismantling the colonial bias in their own practice and decision-making. I'm tired of paramilitaristic, toxic culture of the public safety institutions that are supposed to protect and rehabilitate. Their inability to make substantive changes is both frustrating and incredibly harmful to Indigenous people. They actually perpetuate intergenerational trauma. I'm tired of decades of funding formulae and policies that underfund the Indigenous child welfare, educational, and housing departments, further entrenching poverty and despair. I'm tired of a society that mobilizes racism and apathy to blame, shame, and guilt people in poverty for their misery, but will provide assistance for businesses and corporations that find themselves struggling during a crisis. I'm tired of big ideas, roundtables, inquiries, and reports with no action. I'm tired of seeing the next best strategy, model, or program that was not developed with Indigenous perspectives and does nothing to promote self-determination. Senators, I hope you are too. Thank you. Hi.